What's up, guys? It's good to be back with you. I'm excited about this episode. Excited. I'm excited to talk through divorce and the death of my ego. I've been waiting for this episode because it's a big part in my deconstruction journey. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. And to start the discussion, I'm going to talk about a book. So in 2018, I discovered a book on divorce that caught my attention. It was called What Did Jesus Really Say About Divorce? At the time, I had it in an Amazon cart or something, and I didn't purchase it, and I lost it basically. I couldn't find it. I couldn't remember the name of the book because I didn't purchase it at that time. And I couldn't figure out what it was. I actually ended up looking for it for months because I had read enough on like what the topic was that I was really interested to read it, but couldn't figure out what it was. So somehow I was able to make the connection that I thought that author had spoken at our OPC church. His name's Todd Bordow. And I looked up his book, and sure enough, it was the one that I had previously discovered. What did Jesus really say about divorce? The book was actually Todd's dissertation, and it was free online. So I downloaded it and started reading it. And over the course of a few years, I read it probably 4 or 5 times at least. So beneath reading that book was a desire to escape my marriage. My relationship was emotionally disconnected, and I was searching for an escape hatch. At the time, I was looking for a way out where I could still be obedient to God, but walk away from what I experienced as an emotionally disconnected relationship. However, I quickly discovered that there were multiple layers keeping me in my marriage that ran much deeper than simply obeying the Christian rules. What ran much deeper was Russ McCary's ego. My reputation was on the line, not just how other people would see me, but how I would see myself was on the line. I was a deep thinking Christian and an aspiring future theologian, and getting a divorce would have massive consequences on my life trajectory, my family, and my own identity. I had no clue when I started reading that book that it would be catalysts in my deconstruction process, but it ended up being one of the biggest. So this video is not meant to be a book overview. What I wanted to say about that book is that it really challenged the modern Western evangelical consensus on divorce. But even more, it opened my mind to the idea that the Bible requires interpretation. And while evangelicalism likes to cling tightly to the idea that Scripture is always easy to understand and create a black and white moral framework in many places, a lot of times it is very much harder to understand, being removed from that context, and there's a lot of nuances to it. This is similar to points I made in my 4th video on hell and how so much of our modern hermeneutic on reading the Bible is based on the doctrine of eternal conscious torment, which isn't even abundantly clear. And we've done the same thing with a lot of concepts in Scripture, I've discovered, another of which is the idea of divorce only being allowed in 2 cases. What Todd actually demonstrates in his work is that Scripture is not abundantly clear on divorce, at least as much as evangelicalism is clinging on to. The Old Testament really doesn't have that much to say, other than the provision that is allowed to the Israelites, where a woman could leave husbands that weren't essentially providing to them. That's an oversimplification, but essentially that's what it was. And even Jesus doesn't talk a whole lot about divorce. There's a couple statements that come up, but in the context, there's not a lot of clarity. And even with Paul in the New Testament, it's interesting that Paul adds an additional qualifier to what Jesus already said, which right there shows you it's not actually that black and white. There's a lot of nuance to it. Otherwise, Paul wouldn't have had the freedom to do that. So as far as the two-reason view of divorce is concerned, which would be adultery or abandonment, that view has really found its way into the moral handbooks of modern evangelicalism. And Todd demonstrates in that book that the reality is, not only is it not that clear in Scripture and not talked about that much, but many differing views existed throughout church history, which I'm not going to go over all those. I'm just giving you a high level here. So the point is, as I hope you're hearing from me in this series, whether you agree with it or not, many views implies that interpretation isn't as simple, and that the issue, as demonstrated by thousands of years of opinions and interpretation, is more complex than many of us would like to believe. Nuance is scary, and it's most definitely harder to control people with, and very inconvenient for the fundamentalist. The fundamentalist will assert that he has found the truth and you should listen to him. In fact, I want to take the opportunity to review some of what my ex-fundy friends have been saying about me to make a point on this. So I recently saw a post from my friend John Fonville. Our friend Russ McCary is a perfect example of what you comment on, which he's responding to a comment. His apostasy is heartbreaking. He has set himself up as the sole authority of what is and isn't true. And what's so funny about this is John's done that too. Everybody does this, right? We all have our subjective interpretation of reality. Now, John has chosen to accept that the Reformed confessions are truth, right? And so that's his argument, is that he's not trusting in self, he's trusting in what the Church of the Ages has rested on. But even that's subject to interpretation. So if you dug into John Fonville's history, you would see that he's constantly promoting what R. Scott Clark says, and what Michael Horton says, and what so-and-so says. And he is the one individually that has chosen to make them authorities in his life. We all choose our own authorities. It's a fantasy to believe that we are not all the sole authorities on what we choose to believe in. We all are, right? We're all subjective. We all have to make the choice as to what worldview and reality we think is most consistent with what we experience. That's a given. And it's an illusion for him to present it as if he doesn't do the exact same thing. We're all subjective. Now, we have a different perspective, and that's fine. But for him to make it seem like he's not the authority of what he chooses to believe in too is disingenuous, and it's inconsistent. Everybody does this. Everybody chooses what they want to believe in, and everybody's their own authority of what they choose to rest in. Now, for me at this point, obviously, I see the fact that, yes, there are Reformed confessions, but there are lots of confessions, right? I see validity in a lot of the things that were in the Reformed confessions, but I also see a lot of BS in there. And that's just the conclusion that I've come to, and he's come to a different conclusion. So I wanted to point that out, that it's interesting that he's accusing me of asserting that I found the truth when he does the exact same thing, right? The fundamentalist does it. In fact, even more than me, I won't press my truth on you because I realize you're a subjective person as well. And I don't need you to believe what I believe to validate what I believe. That's not why I'm sharing this. And contrary to what he posted in that comment, this sure as hell isn't a fucking celebration. This is me just being honest with the splinters in my mind. A lot of times, this sucks, sharing this stuff, because I know people like John and others, they don't like what I'm saying, and they're offended by it. And that's why John shared it with his friend Steve because it makes him feel better to share with his buddy who agrees with him, right? And so that's fine. That's the perspective he has. So going back to the book, reading this book multiple times showed me that views can pervade in Christian culture that actually aren't even grounded in Scripture. And this is because what I've come to see is that Christian culture is much more about human psychology than it is any actual biblical ethic. And making it seem as if it's so all simple to understand, it's disingenuous, and it's more of a psychological need of someone to be grounded in something absolute. Now, I know the argument that against relativism that would basically say, well, if you say that the truth is that there is no truth, that's circular. But that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the search for truth is much more nuanced than fundamentalism would want you to believe. I believe there's truth out there, right? I've got to be consistent with my logic, and I think, like many others, I'm searching for that, which is why I'm deconstructing. I'm willing to even separate from old relationships and, have people pissed off at me in my search for truth, right? So I believe there's objectivity. What I'm saying is that it's not as clear cut as fundamentalists want you to believe, where if you don't believe A, B, C, and D, you're wrong. You are wrong, right? It's just the prioritization of belief sets is very convoluted in that sense. So just wanted to make that clarification because I know the argument of the other side and how they're going to try and pigeonhole me and say, oh, well, you're just a relativist. Or maybe they'll say you're an atheist. Well, it's not that simple. I'm not an atheist. I'm just more open to the fact that I'm being much more honest with what I don't know. So that's a very different issue. So for me, regarding divorce, I started to see that divorce was a very complex issue, most of which was never addressed in Scripture. And I started to realize the Bible isn't very concerned with divorce beyond a few minor references. I started to realize that staying married was elevated to a primary Christian ethic despite its secondary or even tertiary treatment in Scripture, if even that. And then I started to see it. There was a correlation between pain and how many prioritize Christian ethics. Divorce is very painful, and it's very difficult, and there's a lot of layers, and there's consequences for it. And therefore, it made sense to me that divorce would get pegged as one of the big Christian no-nos. While more sinister and sneaky sins that the Bible talks much more about, like pride, narcissism, gaslighting others, invalidating their realities, and other harmful social dynamics that are implications of Scripture, were practically ignored in Christian circles. And it's just because they don't cause as immediate and as visible of consequences as something like the divorce. So it's not really based on what Scripture prioritizes. It's based on how humans experience it, right? That is more about human psychology than it is theology. And the same can be said of what's prioritized in a lot of the confessions. So those who get divorces in Christian circles are often shamed, treated as less than Christians, less than citizens of the kingdom, while narcissist, prideful, celebrity figure pastors are often celebrated and elevated. It's the things that Jesus was getting very mad about in his time from the religious leaders. It's nonsense. But when you start becoming conscious of emotional health and your concept of ethics starts getting more mature, you start to see how primitive the ethics of many Christians are and why trauma is actually so pervasive in Christian communities, families, and circles, and why abuse has become so rampant in the church. But divorce, for me, became a doorway to deconstruction because as I really dug in and studied, I learned how Much more nuance was involved in relationships, emotional suppression, how trauma causes disconnect in relationships. And I had to start really digging into why I actually wanted a divorce in the first place. I had to get deep into the psychology of my own mind. And behind the why, I found much more than I ever bargained for, which in many ways led to my deconstruction. I wasn't in the marriage because I was in love anymore. I was in my marriage because of my fear of rejection, because of my ego, because of the practical consequences, and because of how I might hurt my kids that grew up in a divorced home. Now, don't get me wrong. I wanted to find love again in my marriage. I wanted it to work. And in many ways, it would have been a lot easier for so many reasons. There is an analogy in Todd Bordow's book about a business partner stealing from your business and the hurt that would result from that. You might forgive the person, but you would not be wrong to not ever want to go into business with them again. And the point of that analogy is just that you can be so hurt in a relationship that it's not wrong to not want to agree to the terms of a similar relationship again. Despite the fact that you may forgive the person. So I came to a place where I believed love could die in a marriage and that God didn't desire for two people to keep pressing into that long term. I came to a place where it wasn't fair to stay with my wife if I couldn't love her the way she deserved. And trust me, I prayed for years for God to give me a special love for her that would heal our relationship and help us go on. But it just wasn't there. And I want to pause here for a second. Some of you may be watching this thinking, well, you just gave up. You didn't try hard enough. But if you're not married, you have no idea what you're talking about. So, maybe you should get married first before you have any judgment. If you are married, your marriage is not the same as mine was. Now, you may project your own experiences onto me and assume but you don't. Just because the scripture says, nothing new has come onto man doesn't mean all of our marriages are the same. And just because you've stayed in your marriage and it's been hard doesn't mean that the challenges that I experienced in my marriage were the same. Now, it would be easy to assume that because that's going to make you feel better about your decision to stay in your possibly miserable marriage. But at the end of the day, you just don't know what I went through. And this is where Christians get in trouble. They think that everything is very simple and they don't make space for nuance. It's psychological immaturity. So in my case, accepting that reality that I couldn't resurrect my love, I couldn't force it. It's one of the hardest things I've ever had to accept. And I didn't always handle it in the best ways. Right? I'm human. I'm not for 1 second going to say I didn't contribute to anything to my marriage falling apart. I had childhood traumas that contributed to my marriage falling apart, right? I'm not going to point the finger and say it was my spouse's fault, right? There were things that I contributed to the relationship that caused it to get there. But that didn't change the fact that it got there, right? And there's nothing that I could do at that point. It was over. I came to the place where, despite the potential personal and social consequences toward me for the decision, I fully embraced that it was completely irresponsible to stay married in the state I had reached. In my mind, divorce, while more painful short term, actually became the right thing, not only for me, but for everybody involved. Contrary to what you might assume about me, I tend not to be able to do anything, especially decisions of this magnitude, unless I can come to a place where I believe it's the right thing. Accepting this required something much harder than I could ever imagine. An ego death and a strike to my very identity. I had to completely let go of the tribe's validation of me as a good man, or for their validation of me as a good person. My parents, my old church friends, the friends that would be convinced I was the majority culprit or the villain in the whole thing. all affected me. But there was no way out of this pit without having some rocks thrown at me, some big ones. And if I was dependent on others to prop up my ego, I would be forced to stay in the marriage for the wrong reasons. Trust me, I saw a lot of these consequences before I did what I did. That's why I stayed in it as long as I did. So I had to die. I had to let go. I had to realize that doing the right thing for me was actually the thing that most of my tribe would tell me was wrong, and was actually the hardest decision I would ever have to make in my whole life. But it wasn't just right for me. I did it because I believed it was right long-term for my kids, and even right for my ex-wife. Because if I couldn't love her the way she deserved, I couldn't stay with her. And it was more loving to be honest and walk away than try to pretend. And then, force her to stay in a lifeless marriage for the rest of her life. Not going to do that to her, and I'm not going to do that to me. So I hit a point where I accepted that divorce was actually supposed to be a part of my journey, because it involved a complete rejection of my ego that was dependent on so many of the people whose opinions mattered so much to me. So in a nutshell, I hope you've seen that my decision to divorce had a lot of layers. And while I didn't get into too much detail, I want to make the point that each person's relationship and story is complex. If anyone tries to make it black and white, they're ignorant, they're childish, and they have a need to project meaning onto the situation for self-affirmation, for whatever their reasons are. And I'm guilty of that projection in the past. But I'll tell you what, my own divorce has made me much slower to speak and much more quick to want to listen to people and actually want to hear them out. I've become suspicious of myself and assigning meaning to others that makes me feel safe in my a priori belief system. And I think we'd all do well to slow down and be willing to hear people out. I lost multiple friends who never took the time to hear out my side of the story. I lost multiple friends who wanted to assign religious meaning to my decisions. But the thing is, if you weren't in the relationship again, you simply don't have enough information to understand all the intricacies of what was really going on. And for some of you out there who came to me assigning meaning to my decisions before you even discussed them with me, you shouldn't be surprised that I didn't want to speak to you. Because to me, that's a great evidence that you're not there to listen, you're there to project. And all you're going to use that conversation for is to reaffirm and recycle and circular logic your own worldview. You're not there to learn, you're there to tell me what to do. And I'm not really there to have that conversation. Relationships and divorces are complex and they're nuanced. And when Christians came blazing down their black and white trails with all the answers and assumptions, I saw their bullshit. And it pushed me further down this road of deconstruction, just created more and more questions. It lined up with so much immaturity, and I just couldn't do it anymore. So much of me wanted to stay in the comfort of my reformed certainty, trust me. But I was shoved out of that place. I had no choice. The thing is, when you take time to really dig in, do the work, and see yourself honestly, oftentimes you start seeing others' bullshit much more clearly. You can see the motives behind the behaviors and the unconscious projection because you used to do the same damn thing. It's like me with my 7-year-old son. When he's doing something and he doesn't think I can see him doing that, because I've matured out of that stage of life and my perspective is a little bit more developed, I can look and know what he's trying to do, and he doesn't even know that. It's the same thing. When we mature psychologically into different phases of human development, and other people who are in prior phases that we're in behave in the same ways that we used to project their own insecurities, you can see the motives. So while my deconstruction was started by my own questions and realizations, I have Christians to thank for just confirming everything I was seeing and turbocharging the process. Starting to realize that most of the Christians I knew were some of the most emotionally unconscious people was a mindfuck, honestly. And it pressed all these deconstruction splinters more to the front of my mind. So divorce, for me, like many, was a massive, massive catalyst to starting to ask some of the key questions that showed me that life was not so simple and black and white. If my personal growth journey of love and kindness involved an increased ability to see and appreciate nuance, it didn't any longer make sense to me that the God of the universe was stuck in a much more primitive stage of moral understanding and grace than I was. Therefore, my old conception of God had to go. I obviously was creating idols of the actual God of the universe since he is far beyond me. So if I was progressing beyond my old conception of God, I proved to myself that my conception of God was inconsistent in the first place. And in my estimation, this is the case for most evangelicals, and especially the folks at my old Reformed circles. So I just couldn't do it anymore. And in many ways, it was divorce that forced me into that place to start seeing how I was treated, seeing that things were more nuanced, and all the things that led me to where I am today. So, in the words of Martin Luther, here I stand, I can do no other. I love you guys, and I'll talk to you next week.